May the 9th in Europe is the EU's Europe Day, and the French president right now arriving in Berlin after making a speech at the European Parliament. Emmanuel Macron alongside Olaf Scholz for something that's a tradition. The French president, after any French president is inaugurated, his first foreign visit is to Berlin. In this particular case, Macron was sworn in for a second term on Saturday. There he is alongside the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And we can cross to Berlin and France 24 correspondent Nick Spicer. Nick, obviously the shadow of what's happening in Ukraine and what happened earlier on Red Square in Moscow looms large.
It really does, strike people's minds here. I think you have the image here in Berlin of historic enemies, France and Germany, come together, now allies, and then further to the east, just a 9 hours drive to Lviv from Berlin, you have the former allies, the Ukrainians and the Russians at war. And I think the leaders here from France and Germany are mindful of giving an example and working on coming together on Ukraine. They've come a long, long way in terms of policy, in terms of pushing forward. Germany making that 180-degree turn from its pacifist past and deciding to spend 100 billion euros extra on its army to send heavy weapons to Ukraine, whereas it has had a long-standing ban on sending weapons into a conflict zone, rethinking its dependence on hydrocarbons, putting an end to that Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. Big changes for Europe and a big opportunity for France and Germany to come together and work together. They're, of course, the historic Franco-German motor of Europe, the two countries that, when they come to decide, drive things forward. The coincidence happens to be that Germany is exercising the presidency of the G7, so has outsized influence there, and France is exercising the presidency of the European Union, so they speak with a much louder voice, forgive the loud music, than they would traditionally. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of things that they disagree on.
Yeah, you could argue, Nick, that with a French president who's just been reelected and who's the favorite to win legislative elections, that after Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron's the new president of Europe?
He can't do things alone. I think he is perhaps the most powerful leader, partly because of the structure of the French presidency. Olaf Scholz, if he wants to move forward with France, he has to consult with his coalition partners. He has to consult with the Bundestag. He doesn't have a free rein in foreign policy and building things in Europe and engaging in, let's say, military expeditions in Africa, for example, as the French president can. So by almost institutional default, Emmanuel Macron, despite coming from a slightly smaller country in terms of population and economics, has a louder voice, and of course has a seat in the United Nations Security Council on nuclear weapons. So France, I guess to a certain extent, is the loudest, the country perhaps with the most power, certainly the most ideas that are on the table moving forward, and many of those are what Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron are going to be looking at, including possibly accelerating Ukraine's admission into the European Union one day.
I was going to ask, how do Germans feel about it?
How do they feel about France potentially leading it? I think they're looking at Emmanuel Macron. They're used to him coming up with a lot of ideas. We cast our mind back to his time in power when Angela Merkel was the German Chancellor. He put forward some ideas, for instance, at that famous speech at the Sorbonne, calling for strategic autonomy or defense sovereignty. And then there were basically years during which the French were waiting for some kind of answer from Angela Merkel. Now those answers have been forthcoming, and the Elysee, I think, is relieved to have a partner that is willing to do business on a whole range of dossiers that the Germans weren't willing to talk about before. One big thing that came about as a result of the coronavirus, of all things, was this idea that Europe could borrow money from the financial markets in its own name. You remember they set up that $700 billion coronavirus recovery fund Olaf Scholz was a finance minister who crossed the T's and dotted the I's. Now he's the German Chancellor. It doesn't mean that the Germans are willing to spend more money, but it means that that is something that they're willing to talk about, and certainly more flexibility when it comes to decision making. One thing that involves is something called qualified majority voting, which means basically of all the countries in the European Union, they won't all have a veto anymore. And this is something that Italy, which is one of the founding members of the European Union, is calling for as well. So more flexibility, more ability to act when it comes to foreign and defense policy. That is something that I think the two leaders will be looking at really quite closely.
Nick Spicer